They took me at dawn, when the fog lay heavy like cotton on the fields, soaking into the seams of the jacket she had sewn with such care, that jacket Irina stitched for me the Sunday before I was called away. I still remember her hands trembling with exhaustion and hope, but now I cannot even picture her face. It's as though that gentle outline was erased by the war itself. I wrote about her every night in my mind, letter by letter, memory by memory, but I did it without paper, without pen, because there was none. All I had was that memory, ephemeral and stubborn, the only thing they could never take from me. Her name, Irina, whispered like a prayer in the cold darkness of the Gulag near Arkhangelsk, where the ice bit through my boots, and each breath sounded like a lie I told myself to keep going. Yet with each passing winter, her face faded. First, the color of her hair blurred. Was it dark chestnut or soft honey? Then the shape of her smile slipped through my fingers. Did she open her mouth wide when she laughed, or did she fold her lips softly like a secret? I clung to those fragments as if they were life rafts, holding on to her like one holds onto air. And without realizing it, the war didn't just take her from me, it stole even my memory of her. Some survivors talk about losing hope. I lost more than that. I lost the face of the only person who made me believe in a life beyond suffering, and that's a wound invisible to any scar. I write this now, older, still aching, settled in a quiet American town where winters aren't as harsh, where the snow isn't as relentless, and where the silence isn't so loud, as if by confessing it, I can somehow rescue what remains of us. If this story speaks to something lost in your own heart, something beautiful and terrible at once, please like and subscribe. It helps us share stories that resonate, that heal, that remind us we're not alone. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next will change everything. I met her in Łódź, in a textile factory that smelled of steam and oil and fatigue. A place where people kept their eyes to themselves and words to a minimum, not out of rudeness, but because exhaustion made language feel heavier than silence. But she, Irina, she looked at me like she already knew me. That kind of look you get once in a lifetime if you're lucky. It wasn't a spark. No, it was steadier than that. It was as if my face had been waiting her whole life to arrive in front of her. She wore a faded blue dress with a torn sleeve, hair tucked under a scarf, her hands red from the machinery. But when she smiled, God, when she smiled, the whole floor seemed to slow down. I felt something inside me unravel, something that had been tightly wound since boyhood, and I knew in that moment that no matter what happened in the world, in Poland, in Europe, in the war everyone knew was coming, I had found the beginning of my own story. We didn't date like young people do now. There were no promises under fairy lights, no pictures, no social celebrations. There were alleyway walks under a sky that seemed too quiet, glances stolen while passing each other bolts of fabric, moments when our fingers touched, almost by accident. The city was already holding its breath. The Germans were near. Rumors spread like sickness, infecting everything. But still, we walked through Żudliska Park and watched children feed pigeons as if the world still held space for softness. We didn't talk much about the future, not out of fear, but out of reverence, as if naming it would break it. But she told me about her mother who died young, and I told her about my brother who never came back from Silesia. In those quiet exchanges, we stitched something together, something real, something unspoken. Then came the letter, that terrible little envelope with my name and the red seal. I was being called, drafted, sent east. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She sat down at the table in silence, looked at me for a long time, and said only, "Then we must remember now, everything." I didn't know what she meant until she stood, walked to the wardrobe, and took out a small black and white photo, her portrait, wrapped in a thin handkerchief. "For when you need to remember what love looks like," she whispered. I carried that photo through the first months of the war, folded close to my chest, beneath layers of wool and leather, next to my dog tags. In the moments before an ambush, before shelling, before sleep, I pressed it to my heart like it had the power to shield me, and in a way it did. But then one day everything shifted. The Soviets came like a winter storm. No warning, no escape. Our unit was scattered. I was beaten, dragged into a train car with no windows, no food, no water. I never saw my captain again. I never saw my rifle. I never saw that handkerchief again. The photo, her face, gone. And I was left with nothing but memory. At first, I thought I could hold on to it. Her lips, the curve of her jaw, her hair whipping in the wind near the tram stop. I tried to reconstruct her every night with my mind as my only canvas. But memory, it's not loyal. It reshapes, it fills in gaps with lies, it shifts and bends. And I began to realize I couldn't remember if her smile was wide or shy, if her eyes were green or gray. I couldn't even be sure which version of her I was clinging to. That's when the fear began, the deeper kind, not of death, but of forgetting someone you promised to love forever. The days in the camp bled into each other like ink in water, slow, suffocating, and impossible to separate. There were no Mondays, no Sundays, no birthdays or holidays. There was only the cold. That Russian kind of cold, the kind that wraps itself around your bones like rope, not letting go even when the sun is out. We were buried in snow, in silence, in sameness. Even our shadows seemed tired. I stopped counting the days after a few months. What was the point? There was no one waiting for me. No letters, no word from the outside world. The last thing I had of her, Irina's photograph wrapped in a handkerchief, had been taken during the capture. In that one moment, everything I clung to was stripped away. And yet, somehow, I clung harder. At night, when the barracks went dark and the only sound was the labored breathing of men too weak to snore, I would close my eyes and build her face again, piece by piece, line by line. Her hair, soft, wasn't it? Did she tie it back or let it fall over her shoulders? Her lips, full or narrow? I couldn't remember. I told myself stories just to keep the image alive. We would walk by the river hand in hand. I imagined letters she would have written. I heard her voice, or thought I did, repeating my name like a thread through the dark. It was survival, mental survival. In the place where your name can be forgotten within a week of your death, where you are just another coughing, limping ghost among ghosts, love becomes the only proof that you were once whole. So I created new memories, ones that never happened. I imagined her baking bread. I imagined us with a child. I imagined coming home and her waiting at the station, wearing that same blue dress with the torn sleeve. That one I knew was real. But the more I tried to remember her, the more I felt her slip away. It was like holding sand in my hands. The tighter I gripped, the faster it ran through my fingers. I began to notice the blanks, gaps in the details. At first I thought they were temporary, symptoms of exhaustion or cold. But they stayed, they widened. And then one day, I couldn't remember the color of her eyes. I couldn't remember how she walked. I couldn't remember if she had freckles. Worse, I started to invent new features, a different voice, a different smile. Was I remembering her or creating someone else? Was the love I felt still hers, or was it just mine now, shaped by loneliness, by grief, by time? That's when the guilt settled in. The deep, aching guilt that you've betrayed the person you love simply by forgetting them, even if you tried not to, even if you fought every day to hold on. And that's when I understood something terrible, that I might survive the camp, but the version of her I carried might not. One night, in the bitterest cold of the season, the kind where your breath turns solid before it leaves your mouth, I sat up in the dark and traced her face in the frost that had crept along the wood of the wall, just my finger drawing an outline. I didn't cry. I couldn't, but my hand trembled because nothing I drew looked right, because I didn't know where her cheekbones were anymore, because I couldn't get the eyes to match, because I didn't know if I was drawing her or a ghost I'd created. And that was when I realized I had begun to love a memory more than I ever knew her truth. In that camp, time wasn't measured in hours, but in erasures, little things you forget until nothing is left. You start with the smell of their skin, then the pitch of their voice, then the tilt of their head when they listen, then the shape of their smile. And one day, you wake up and realize you've forgotten the only face that ever looked at you like you were more than this. When they finally released us, the forgotten soldiers, the ones who had no one left to claim them, it was 1947. The war was long over for the rest of the world, but not for us. For us, it had crystallized inside our bones. We returned to cities we no longer recognized, speaking languages that had shifted in our absence, to streets with unfamiliar names and people who didn't look at us the way they once had. I stepped off the train in Łódź like a ghost, the same station, the same tracks, but none of it felt mine. I walked with a limp I hadn't had before, my clothes hanging off a thinner frame, my breath catching at the scent of chimney smoke. Every sound, a child crying, a tram bell ringing, echoed from a time I no longer belonged to. I went straight to the place I remembered most clearly, the building on Kilinskiego Street, 3rd floor, near the tram stop, where her window had once faced the morning sun. But the building was boarded up, damaged. A sign hung crooked on the door, condemned. I stared at it for a long time, hoping maybe she'd step out of the shadows, apron dusted with flour, eyes squinting against the light. But no one came. I knocked on doors nearby, asked neighbors, described her dark hair, blue eyes, I thought, worked at the factory. Some shook their heads, some turned away. One woman told me softly, "Many girls left for the West after the war. Many changed their names. Some were taken." I tried the factory next, or what remained of it. Rubble, mostly. A few names on a registry, none of them hers. And that's when the worst realization settled in. Even if she were alive, even if she were standing in front of me, I wouldn't know it. I wouldn't recognize her. How do you ask forgiveness from someone whose face you've lost? How do you say, "I loved you," when you can't even picture their smile? I spent weeks wandering the city, calling her name silently in my mind. I went to church, to the parks, to the streets we'd walked. I thought maybe she'd appear like a sign, like in a novel. But life isn't like that. No orchestra swells. No serendipity arrives. Once, in a bakery, I saw a woman with her posture, the way she tilted her head, the way her hand hovered near her mouth when she laughed. I stared too long. She noticed. I looked away. She left. And I never knew if it was her. That kind of doubt, it poisons you slowly. After a while, I began to ask myself the question that would follow me for the rest of my life. What if I only remembered the idea of her? What if the woman I loved no longer existed, or worse, had been replaced by a version my mind had invented to survive? I stopped looking, not out of acceptance, but out of mercy, for both of us. I had nothing left to offer her but a broken memory, and if she had found peace, I had no right to disturb it. And yet, even in surrender, there was pain, a quiet kind, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that lingers when a song plays or when the scent of soap reminds you of another lifetime. She became a silence I carried, the loudest silence of all. Years passed, not the kind that glide by gently, but the kind that stack on your shoulders, heavy and slow, like bricks added one by one to a wall you can never quite finish. I lived, if that's the right word. I married, I worked, I raised children, and I tried, truly, to be present, to be kind, to build a quiet life brick by brick, even though there was always a missing stone, one I never dared to name. The woman I married was good, steady, patient. She never asked about the war, not directly. Perhaps she sensed that some wounds weren't meant to be probed. Perhaps she knew that the silences between my words were filled with someone else's name. I never spoke of Irina, not once. Not out of shame, not even out of guilt, but because there are some loves too fragile to touch, even with the truth. I built a new life in America, like so many others who had nothing left to return to. I found work, bought a house, watched my kids grow up speaking a language I'd learned later in life. I gave them birthdays, steady meals, warmth. I gave them all I could, except that one part of me that stayed locked in a Polish winter. Then one day, years later, in a quiet New England town I barely knew, I walked into a small used bookstore, one of those dimly lit places that smell of paper and time. And there it was, a worn poetry book, nothing special. The title didn't catch my eye. But as I reached for it, the book slipped, fell open, and on the inside cover, in delicate handwriting, I saw it. To the one who remembers my story, even if he forgets my face. No signature, no date, just that. I stared at it for what felt like a full season. The handwriting, familiar, something in the slant of the letters, in the way remembers, curved slightly upward. My heart was hammering so hard I could barely breathe. I turned the pages. It was a collection of poems about longing, about memory, about lost names and imagined reunions. I read it cover to cover in a single sitting. In a coffee shop nearby, my tea went cold. The world outside the window blurred as the words on the page pulled me back to a place I thought was long buried. I don't know if the book was hers. I'll never know, but in that moment I decided to believe it was, because sometimes belief is all we have left. I bought the book, brought it home, placed it on my shelf beside the photograph of my wife, the woman who shared the rest of my life, who never knew about the girl from Wodge with the chapped hands and the fierce, quiet love. That was my peace offering, not between two women, but between two versions of myself. I never told my children or my grandchildren. To them, I was just grandpa, quiet, gentle, with a shelf of books I never lent out. But each night, before I turned off the light, before I closed my eyes, I whispered Irina's name, not for her, for me, to prove that I hadn't forgotten everything. I'm 82 now. The years sit heavy on my shoulders, and the world feels quieter than it used to, not because it is, but because I no longer run to fill the silence. My hands tremble, my knees ache when the weather changes, and some days I forget where I left my keys or why I walked into a room. But one thing I haven't forgotten is her name, Irina. I don't remember her face. That truth still stings. I've searched for it in dreams, in the steam on bathroom mirrors, in the faces of strangers on crowded sidewalks. But it's gone, not in anger, not in loss, but like the end of a song you can no longer hum, because it's been too long since you heard it. That's the kind of forgetting I live with. The kind that doesn't rip things away. It simply lets them fade, slowly, gently, like snow melting from the edge of a window pane. And yet, what remains after all these years is the feeling, the warmth of her name on my tongue, the hush in her presence, even when she's not there. The echo of her love in every act of kindness I tried to give to others, in every moment of stillness I shared with my wife, who never asked about the parts of me I couldn't name. Irina never had a grave I could visit, no goodbye letter, no official ending, but she lives in the space between my thoughts, in the quiet rituals I perform without realizing. The way I fold a handkerchief before placing it in my drawer, the way I pause when I hear a woman laugh in the street and think, just for a heartbeat, could it be? I know now that love doesn't need a face to endure. It needs only a moment of truth and a heart willing to hold it. The war took pieces of me I never got back. It took youth. It took certainty. It took the only photograph I had of the girl who made me feel alive before the world broke apart, but it didn't take the story. Because even if the details are gone, even if her eyes, her lips, her smile have dissolved into memory, the feeling remains. And maybe that's enough. Maybe love doesn't need to be remembered perfectly. Maybe it just needs to have been real. We share true stories like this every day. Stories of love, loss, and everything in between. If this one touched your heart, let us know in the comments and subscribe. You never know, the next story might be yours.